look behind the parties at Posidonia. Could MSC really buy Hapag-Lloyd? And the Strait of Hormuz is in confusion. All of these and much more on the latest episode of Maritime in Minutes. Hi, it's Marcus Hand here, editor of Seatrade Maritime News, with our June news roundup, Maritime in Minutes. I'm joined as usual by our correspondent, Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. The month of June started off with shipping converging on Greece for Posidonia. And Gary, can you kick us off by taking us back to Party Central and the first week of June?
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, some of the Seatrade editorial team made their way to Athens in the first week of June for Posidonia. We were covering the show, all the associated events, as well as putting together the show daily Posidonia Today. The first panel discussion at the Tradewinds Shipowners Forum was a highlight for me during the week. It dealt with a theme that came up time and time again at Posidonia, and that was resilience. Charis Plakitonaki, Chief Strategy Officer at Star Bulk Carriers, told the audience there that average bulker speeds had dropped to 11 knots as owners adjusted to the new optimal speed for higher bunker prices, tightening vessel supply in the market even further. There were higher insurance premiums and sanction risks, of course, which were the downsides, along with the obvious security risks in the Gulf. This is something that Star Bulk knows all too well. I spoke to their president, Hamish Norton, at CMA Shipping within just a few hours of one of their ships being hit by a missile a few days into the conflict earlier this year. Cargill Ocean Transportation Vice President Global Operations James Lewis said he'd not seen change on this scale in his 20 years at the company, and that flexibility in the fleet and the technology that Cargill was deploying were sort of a key to survival. Without specifically calling out the US administration, he said that Cargill found itself flipping day by day at one point on whether it wanted Japanese or Chinese-built tonnage in its fleet, a difficult situation for a company that's put together a Japanese-built fleet over the years. There were plenty more interesting insights from the panel, but I'll just pick out a thought from moderator Julian Bray, who is editor-in-chief at Tradewinds. He said that shipping was in need of a bit of a rebrand in these current times, and that the appropriate tagline for the industry is no longer "we'll move your cargo as efficiently as possible," and instead something more like "we'll fix your problems for a premium." The discussion certainly covered plenty of problems in the market, although many of those were for the ship owners and the operators themselves, I think. Marcus?
Now, you mentioned we'll fix your problems for a premium, and I'm kind of going to follow on that topic. So while everyone was busy at Posidonia, I got the opportunity to cover container shipping markets, something I enjoy but is normally the domain of our correspondent Nick Savridis. As it turned out, I picked a pretty good week to take over the reins. If you followed the Q1 results of public listed container lines, you'd have seen a downward trend in their financials, with a few ending up in the red. Was the lengthy boom for the sector finally coming to an end? Well, much like the end of 2023 and Red Sea diversions, geopolitical and supply chain disruptions stepped in and saved the day, this time in the shape of the Iran war, disrupting trade flows, causing port congestion, and making sure Cape of Good Hope rerouting very much stayed in place. The result? An idle fleet at historically low levels of 0.6% of global capacity, according to Alphaliner, and shippers rushing to front-load shipments ahead of expected capacity crunch. The Drewry World Container Index was up some 23% in the first week of June, at $3,433 per FEU on 5 June. The Shanghai Containerized Freight Index was up 16% for the week ended 29th May and 6% for the week ended 6 June. With the two indexes often trading a week or so apart, so you can see the overall trend there. Drewry noted the peak season has started earlier than usual and container spot rates have continued to rise through June as lines rolled out a slew of peak season surcharges. Underscoring the early peak season were the main numbers of US Trans-Pacific gateway ports Long Beach and Los Angeles, with a 31.7% and 17% jump in throughput respectively for the month of May year on year. At least for now, supply chain disruption has saved container lines' bottom lines again, although the new building order book is just shy of 13 million TEU of capacity, some 38.3% of the existing fleet, so surely overcapacity will have to come home to roost at some point. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Thanks, Marcus. I'll take us into the second week of June. In late March, the UK announced that it had given the go-ahead to its military and supporting agencies to carry out boarding operations against sanctioned tankers, and on the 14th of June, it carried out its first seizure of a Dark Fleet tanker. Royal Marine Commandos roped out of a helicopter onto 2009-built Smirtos in the English Channel and managed to take the ship with no shots fired and no injuries, a spokesperson for the MOD told Seatrade Maritime News at the time. The move is an attempt to put further financial pressure on Russia's oil trade. Scaring Dark Fleet vessels from the English Channel would add some distance to trades out of Russia, although there have been Dark Fleet vessel transits since that boarding and seizure. The seizure of the ship without injury is better than some approaches to sanctions enforcement that we've seen in recent times, although it has become a seafarer criminalisation story. 38-year-old Captain AJ Pant has been charged for sanctions breaches and could face up to 10 years in prison if found guilty. The ship remains anchored off the UK coast for now, and the rest of the crew have access to food, water and essentials, according to BBC reports. And the 100,000 tonnes of oil on board may be sold to support Ukraine's war effort. The situation in the English Channel is a little tense at the moment, to put it lightly, when it comes to the Dark Fleet. Some tankers are escorted by the Russian Navy, and one Russian warship that is often used for that purpose fired warning shots at a British yacht in the Channel earlier this month as well. So, more interesting times in shipping.
Indeed there are. Now, that UK seizure of a Dark Fleet tanker in the English Channel showed, as had some previous US interdictions, that sanctions vessels can be stopped without killing or injuring the crew. Unfortunately, in the second week of June, the US blockade of Iranian ports took a rather deadlier turn. In the space of 3 days, 3 tankers were to suffer engine room fires while in the Gulf of Oman. All 3 of which quickly became clear were started by an external source, missiles fired by the US Navy as part of enforcing its blockade. In one case, the firing of a Hellfire missile into the engine room of the tanker Settebello resulted in 3 Indian seafarers being killed. The attack was condemned by the Indian government and the IMO and caused widespread anger and outrage in the shipping community. Underscoring just how needless these deaths were, within a week, the blockade was lifted with the signing of the MOU between the US and Iran, and less than 2 weeks later, we were reporting on 15 large Iranian tankers sailing freely, AIS transponders on, loaded with millions of barrels of crude, and headed towards Asia.
An awful story, whichever way you cut it, but there's something particularly that jumps off the page about reading about Hellfire missiles being used against tankers. I'll take us into the third week though, shall I? And I'll pick up a piece that you wrote, Marcus, titled US-Iran Deal, How Quickly Will the Strait of Hormuz Reopen? I think the piece sort of helps to highlight just how difficult it is to try and report on the sort of practical implications of this conflict. Shipping is, of course, top of the list of affected industries from the closure of Hormuz, but that doesn't mean that we get sort of clear signals as to what on earth is actually going on. After the US and Iran signed their MOU on peace, the strait was supposed to open immediately and the US blockade to be lifted, according to Pakistan's Prime Minister. The actual text of the 14-point agreement say differently, however, as the US was only to begin lifting its blockade immediately and fully end it within 30 days, and Iran was to lift its own restrictions over the strait and allow toll-free transits for 60 days. The wording of the text leaves so much room for interpretation, to my reading, however. As Marcus reported, ships did start moving out of the Gulf, although transit numbers remained well down on pre-war levels. The article, I think, is a great jumping off point for those looking to understand how things sort of should have worked before the events of Marcus's Week 4 pick took place, and perhaps get a greater understanding of why there seemed so little clarity as to what was actually allowed in the strait and why that keeps coming up, why we're not certain on who should be transiting and whether there's a green light there.
Yeah, indeed, it is a very confusing picture, and one that I will come back to in Week 4. Now, for Week 3, I actually went for a story that's seemed like a little bit of an early kick-off to the silly season. And that was reports that MSC was looking to buy Hapag-Lloyd. It was quickly dismissed by various parties involved, with one comment describing it as being more like a fairy tale. However, as another shipping industry financial guru commented, all takeover bids are immediately preceded by a denial. So could MSC actually take over Hapag-Lloyd? Well, it probably does have the financial wherewithal. However, it doesn't really fit MSC's past profile of small-scale acquisitions and organic growth through acquiring large amounts of second-hand tonnage and ordering new buildings. And even if it does want to buy Hapag-Lloyd, there would be significant hurdles. Hapag-Lloyd remains strongly rooted in the city of Hamburg, and it has a stock free float of just 3.6%, so building up a meaningful stake on the open market is not a possible route. There would also be obvious regulatory and competition concerns to any deal given the market share MSC already has, and Hapag-Lloyd itself is also currently involved in taking over Zim, which has its own regulatory challenges in Israel. On top of all that, there is the 18-month Gemini cooperation between Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, formed after the Danish carrier and MSC broke apart their own 2M partnership. So a lot would stand in the way of this mega container line deal, even if the reports do have some truth to them.
Yeah, I was very surprised to see those rumours come up. I did enjoy Nick's piece running through the various conflicts involved. I'll take us into the final week of June. My last pick was a story based on an interview with Verana on the current state of the ship recycling market and what might happen should ships start flowing out of the Gulf again. Hitesh Vyas, VP Middle East and Green Recycling Coordinator, said a change of situation in the Middle East could completely upend the ship recycling market, which is currently stuck in a pattern of limited scrapping candidates, leading to competition between yards and buyers, driving up prices for end-of-life ships. Vessels are being kept away from scrapping by high rates out in most markets, in turn supported by capacity-soaking diversions around the Cape of Good Hope, and even slower steaming, as we've already covered, due to higher bunker prices. Hitesh laid out two separate but related potential impacts on the ship recycling market: the return to the Red Sea transits and the lifting of sanctions on Iran. The end of Red Sea transits would be a particular change for the container market, where deliveries were supposed to lead to more scrapping, but the long haul around Africa has kept rates high and brought tight supply of container ships in that market there. On the upside for everyone involved in end-of-life transactions for ships, Hitesh said that owners have a fair bit of cash on hand this time around, as we've also covered on Seatrade Maritime News. So if the Red Sea opens and the markets turn downwards, owners should be able at least to time the market a little and not be forced into a sale at any price, as has happened in the past. On the Iran sanctions side, most relevant of course for tankers, Hitesh said that lifting of sanctions on Iran could drive cargo to the compliant fleet, leaving the old dark fleet tankers without much work and destined for the cutting torches. He was hoping for a streamlined process when this happens to make sure everyone is on the same page when sanctions are lifted, and complications like blocked payments at the bank can be avoided. He did also go into some detail of what could happen even if sanctions weren't lifted. Ultimately, though, he outlined a scenario where yards may hold off on making deals for ships if the market for old tonnage improves until they're ready to take the ship on. And with an average ship taking 3 to 5 months to recycle and a VLCC taking 10 to 12, yard capacity may fill up quite quickly. There is some extra capacity that could come online should a stronger recycling market drive more yards in Pakistan and Bangladesh to seek Hong Kong convention compliance, but that would take some time for those yards to get accreditation, maybe 12 to 18 months, he said. Owners with a recycling candidate on hand may want to look at getting something arranged sooner rather than later, he said, especially if they have an awkward ship. If and when the market picks up, recycling yards will probably take the easy wins and easier deals rather than worrying too much about the minutiae of awkward ships. Do read that full article though, as Hitesh really knows his stuff on the market, and one way or another, ship recycling is going to have to pick up soon and will have a big impact on all of the shipping markets, I think.
Yep, definitely well worth a read on an important subject. And to round out this episode, I'm going to come back to what has probably been the biggest question in shipping this year. Is the Strait of Hormuz open or not? The signing of the accord between the US and Iran on 19th June for the ceasefire and 60-day negotiating period again brought about the prospect of a proper reopening. The US stood down its blockade of Iranian ports. Iran promised to reopen the strait. With the traffic separation scheme needing demining, 2 routes had opened up, an Iranian one to the north of the traffic separation scheme and another to the south hugging the Oman coast with the guidance of US forces. The threat level dropped to moderate and traffic volumes started to rise to just over 50% of the same time a year earlier on 24th June, according to AXS Marine. Ahead of the Day of the Seafarer, the IMO announced it would be opening up its evacuation route for ships and 11,000 seafarers stranded in the Gulf, using both the northern and southern corridors. This saw Oman publishing details of waiting areas and waypoints for the southern corridor. All seemed to be going well, but Iran got upset at the publication of the southern route and started making threats about the security of vessels that didn't use the Iranian control corridor. On the 25th of June, it made good on these threats, hitting the Singapore-flagged container ship Ever Lovely as it transited the Strait of Hormuz. Following the attack, the IMO suspended its evacuation scheme. Then the US struck Iranian coastal positions in retaliation. Perhaps predictably, Iran hit the Panama-flagged VLCC Tico in the strait at the weekend, and the threat level moved back up to substantial. Tit-for-tat strikes between the US and Iran followed. The situation in the strait remains on edge, but some transits are continuing as the US and Iran appear to have returned to an uneasy ceasefire. And on that note, that's all we have time for on this episode of Maritime in Minutes. Links to all these stories discussed are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you all on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime News Podcast.